You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Hi everyone, it's Paige Smathers. Thanks so much for being here. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at positive-nutrition.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, whatever podcast app you use to listen to this podcast. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hey everyone, welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast. My name is Paige Smathers, and I'm so glad you're here. Before we dive into this week's podcast episode, I wanted to just invite all of you who are registered dietitians or anyone who's a clinician. I am putting on a webinar on April 18th, 2018. So if you're listening to this in the future, this will be a little bit irrelevant to you. But I'm putting on a webinar all about the dietitian's role in substance use disorders. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart and that I feel is really important and kind of often underutilized or not really paid attention to enough. And so I am offering 1.5 continuing education credits for those of you who attend. It's $10 to attend the workshop, and you can sign up at my website at positive-nutrition.com/webinar. This is going to be an hour and a half on April 18th at 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, where I'll be teaching you, some of the most important things you need to know about the dietitian's role in the recovery setting. So if you're a dietitian, this will be especially relevant to you. If you're a therapist or someone else involved in the treatment setting, this might also be really informative and helpful for you as well, just so that you understand how important having a dietitian on the team is and how helpful they can be in the process of recovery. So keep your eye out for that. Head on over to the website to sign up. I can't wait to see you there. And then also, I always like to just make sure everybody knows about the Facebook group for the podcast. That's Nutrition Matters Podcast Community on Facebook. And then I've also had quite a few of you reach out wanting to join the online course. And here's the deal with that. This is kind of the update on my online course. So a couple months ago, I rebranded my business, and things have been pretty crazy ever since then. And things are kind of starting to calm down now. And what I'm going to be working on next is revamping my online course under the Positive Nutrition brand. So keep your eyes out for that. Please let me know if you have any questions. But in the next few months, I'll be relaunching the online course. So for those of you who are interested in joining, just kind of hold tight for a couple months, and we'll see you there when it's time. Okay, so getting on to the podcast episode for the week, I am sharing this conversation that I had with Fiona Willer, who is a registered dietitian in Australia. And we talked about weight science, and she has this really unique background as a registered dietitian, but also an academic. She is going to explain more about her process and her background in the podcast episode, but she is really, really talented and gifted in so many ways, but especially in the world of kind of helping dietitians break down the science and really understand how to be critical consumers of the media. She does that for dietitians. She also does that for lay people. So I thought it'd be a really good fit to bring her on the podcast and talk about kind of the state of the current research on weight science. And I think you're going to really love what she has to say. So without further ado, I bring you Fiona Willer. Well, Fiona, welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is such a pleasure and such a joy to talk to someone from across the world. This is my first time going there in that way. This is really great.
There's a lot of distance between us. That is true.
It is. And you in Australia have such a good little cohort of people doing great work there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, so part of my PhD research looks at dietetic professional culture, and I've surveyed Australian dietitians and international dietitians, mostly US in that particular study. And I would say that your assessment is right. So in Australia, we have a high degree of attitude that weight neutral, weight inclusive practice is a responsible thing for dietitians to do. We tend to all sort of know each other, and it is a much more sort of cohesive movement here than what I observe in the States anyway. There seems to be like a lot, but comparative to the amount of dietitians that exist in the US, comparatively few.
Interesting. That's
Mm.
something you've actually looked at in data with the data.
Yeah, so the first study I did as part of my PhD was looking at dietetic practice and looking at weight management dietitians or dietitians who work with people with weight concern. Because I wanted to survey how much sort of penetration HAES and weight inclusive practice had in the profession, and I wanted to see whether it was deemed a responsible thing for dietitians to do, and I wanted to see what people knew about. So what dietitians, including sort of long term and short term outcomes and things. So that was actually, it really surprised me how pro HAES Australian dietitians were, because I did manage to get a representative sample of weight management dietitians down here, and the sort of approval ratings were in the 80% of, even if the dietitians didn't themselves practice from a weight inclusive perspective, they had a positive attitude about it.
That is fascinating. And do you have any assessment of what it's like in other places in comparison to Australia in terms of like weight
Well,
management dietitians and how they feel about dietitians who practice from that weight inclusive perspective?
I've only got my observations of the sort of communication from the professional organisations and from grassroots dietitians, and I think there's a lot more sort of aggravation that goes on in other places. Our professional organisation here is rather than being outright uh, in conflict with weight neutral approaches, they are sort of silent, which is disappointing, but I think that will change with time given we've got this head of pressure here. So, yeah, it's certainly interesting times. And I know that the way that HAES spreads through dietitians is the same as the way that it spreads through regular humans, and that is through social networks and through collegial networks. So this sort of exposure to the idea that we don't have to have a weight centric focus. Once you hear about that, you can't unhear, and it's a bit viral in that way. So I'm optimistic that even if people don't quite get it completely now, that eventually, your wave of understanding as you get to know more and more will mean that we've got this sort of turning in direction of away from weight centrism over the next sort of decade or so.
It seems like there's been such a shift just in the last few years from what I've
Yeah.
observed and the just things you see on social media and also the things
Hmm.
you hear just in your conversations with
Yeah.
colleagues.
That's it. I mean, certainly there are still a lot of people who are anti-weight inclusive practice, but and from the survey that I did, that what came out of that data was that it was mostly a misunderstanding about what it was, rather than a complete disagreement with the premise. So, yeah, I'm optimistic. I mean, even the body positivity movement has its downsides in that it's sort of being co-opted by diety kind of people now. But and a lot of my friends and colleagues are quite angry about that. I have a sort of more long-term view. I think that any sort of exposure, you can't instantly get it. It's the sort of thing, it's a bit like you peeling back layers of an onion. And so over time, people will get it. And really any shift away from diet culture, even if it's not quite right at the beginning, is a good thing in my mind.
Yeah, I can totally see what you're saying, and I tend to do more of like let's find a middle approach here. Let's look at it in another way rather than feeling reacting so extremely. And I see why there is an extreme reaction or anger about that, but I'm kind of like you where it's like maybe the long term game, this is good.
Yeah.
This
Yeah,
is
I get it.
in people's
Yeah.
vocabulary. The word body positivity is in people's mouths right now, which it maybe wasn't 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Certainly during the 80s.
Oh yeah. Right. Right.
Oh, no.
With spandex and big hair, right?
And allowed and not allowed food lists and
Yes.
calorie counting and all the rest of it. I mean,
All
there
of
was
it.
no room at that time for anyone to
Absolutely.
say, buzz off.
Let's rethink this.
Yeah.
Okay, so we didn't even take a minute to talk about you and what you do. People can probably guess at this point that you are an academic and you are working on your PhD. Is that right?
I am, yeah. So I started my PhD in 2012, and part-time because I was working full-time as an academic then, and in private practice as well, because I clearly cannot manage my lifetime. Anyway, and then I've had my family in that time as well. So I've got 3 kids now, and then the PhD is going to be the 4th child
The
eventually when it
fourth
finally
baby
gets done.
that's going to
Yeah.
be birthed at some point.
That's it. So I mean, my scholarship money runs out at the end of 2019, so it has to be done by then. So I'm in the
There
final
you go.
throes.
You're almost
Yeah,
there. That's
almost there. One
exciting.
last study to do, and then a heap of thesis writing to, tidy up and to finish. So yeah, it's good. I mean, I'm not working full time as an academic now. Because I did realize I don't have unlimited time in my life, but these days, my professional work is doing this kind of stuff. So, communicating weight neutral research to other dietitians and to other health professionals and to the public as well. So, translating what the research actually says and helping people to understand the devil in the details, essentially. So, every weight loss study will show you these principles that we talk about in weight inclusive practice.
That is awesome. And that's a really good sort of outline or framework of what I'm hoping we'll talk about today and why I wanted to have you on this podcast because I've been in this mode with my podcast where I try to sort of explore a particular question or a
Mm-hmm.
certain topic that comes up a lot in my nutrition counseling sessions and
Mm-hmm.
or what I observe just in the public at large or whatever and I've had this come up a lot with okay, well, what's the research behind health at every size or the weight inclusive approach or however someone words it or whatever their questions are. And I
Yeah.
think that it's really valuable to just sit down and say, okay, let's look at this. Let's zoom out on the big picture of our history and of science and of nutrition and weight and bodies, and let's put this all into context, talk about what the issues are with the research that's been done so far and kind of what the research is showing in terms of where we want to ethically align ourselves and also align ourselves with the
Yeah.
evidence in what really works for people in terms of how we offer nutrition counseling and nutrition therapy. So that's sort of
That's
my
right.
overarching goal.
Excellent. I love
Perfect.
that.
Okay, so let's just take a minute. I like the details, but I think they only make sense if we talk globally first.
Mhm.
So, big picture, when you just kind of look at history and science and research and all of this around these topics of bodies and nutrition and health and weight, how would you characterize sort of the context of where we are right now? I know that's a huge question, but I'll ask follow-up ones too.
So I've just recently for my podcast had to put together a sort of packet around the history of BMI. So this is actually really in my brain, in the front of my
Perfect. I
brain
can't
right
wait.
now. And so, I think our heart has really always been in the same place. Our heart is let's try to help humanity, particularly people working in public health and in research spaces tend to have that goal. And I can really understand how we got to where we are today. And that is, that this relationship was noticed, that there was a relationship between weight and eventually between BMI and ill health. And then the panic set in, and the fuel on those fires was this social acceptability of different body types that really didn't have anything to do with research, except that it really directed the sort of questions that researchers ask when they're formulating their research plans. And that, it's so insidious that is where it's come from. And we've now we're in part of this big wave where it's very difficult to get to change the direction of the momentum that we're going in, particularly now that this weight centrism has reached, the WHO deciding on these cutoff levels on an afternoon in 1998 has really set the ship in one direction that's very difficult to turn around.
And you're talking about cutoff levels of BMI, right?
BMI, yeah. When it's a continuous measurement, there's no difference between one. If you stand a person at one BMI next to a person at the next numerical number of BMI and they're across categories, there's not necessarily any difference in any real terms between those two people. So when you turn in continuous data into categories, that is the risk that you take, and that they've done that the WHO has done that, means that it's really mandated allowed the floodgates of research which unfairly categorizes humans together with it's not adjusted for anything. It's not adjusted for lifestyle, not adjusted for age, not adjusted for gender, it's not adjusted for anything. It's not at all interesting at an individual level.
So this was an afternoon in 1998 that you're talking about. What led up to that? Like, was there conversations about weight that were categorized at that point? How did they come up with the numbers? Was it just out of thin air?
Yeah. There were a few really strong personalities during the 70s and 80s. Prior to that, there were these height and weight tables that life insurance companies, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company particularly, had put out. And so it's a table where you look up your age group and your sex and your weight and your height. So they had, you can imagine, tons of different yourself. There was a lot of stuff to look through. And that showed, and they used the average of the population of that age and height. The average weight of the population, age, height, and sex was the ideal for that particular category. And then if you were 110% above the average for that little group, then you were deemed as overweight. And if you're 120% above that, you were deemed as obese. So you can see that those numbers then, it's actually not, it's not great because there's no lifestyle factors, no environmental factors, no lifestyle factors that takes into account. But it's actually a more sensitive measure than everyone in the same bucket. And so there are a couple of personalities during the 70s and 80s, Dr. Garrow, Ansel Keys, who seems to have had his finger in every single pie when it comes to diet and bodies. Character.
Yeah.
I know, right?
He almost had to die for us to start looking at things differently, don't you think? He was such a influential character in the whole fat, in the dietary fat conversation.
So Minnesota Starvation Study, great work there. Very thankful that he was the one who discovered that people go to pieces when they're calorie restricted. And so, and very diligent research, right? So that's good that we have that on the historical record. But then the whole cholesterol and heart disease issue, and then this weight stuff. So he was quite influential in terms of advocating for the change from use of tables to the use of BMI as the metric instead. He was one of the leading voices in that change.
I did not know that.
Rattling the cage. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yep.
Yet another thing.
I know.
He had his hands in.
I don't think I can take any more. If I read any more historical stuff about him, where he's influenced something else that has sort of sent humanity down a path that has not necessarily been helpful, I'm just going to scream. And honestly, all roads lead to him.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so do you know him well? I'm sure you do at this point. When did he pass away? I don't even know this.
Oh, I don't know. I would have to Google that.
Okay.
But because I don't think it was terribly long ago, was it?
I don't think so either. Yeah, when you look at some of the history of even the conversation about dietary fat and his studies and his involvement in that. It's fascinating history.
Yeah.
It really is. Okay. So
The power of personality. That's
you're
really what it comes down to.
for sure, and just how political the scientific and research world can be, don't you think?
Mm. Oh yeah. The I part of part of the BMI history research made me stumble upon reviews of books that were published back in the 70s, and that, I mean, there was so much um, like academic roasting going on between different factions. Um, it's actually quite brilliant. Like, terrible for humanity, but brilliant to read, because this was before emails. It's before electronic journals. People had to, if they had an opinion, they had to write into the journal to get a letter to the editor to disagree about something. And so it's sort of there in the historical record, all of these dissenting views around the meaning of weight and health and BMI and all of that sort of stuff. So people have been screaming from the sidelines that this is not necessarily the way to go since the beginning.
Wow. And would you characterize the beginning? I mean, obviously this is very difficult to do, but just in terms of the research, maybe it getting into the WHO and some of these really big organizations in the 70s and 80s, is that what you would sort of outline it as?
Yeah, so as soon as big government, so, it's one thing for researchers and for commerce to use height and weight tables to conduct their work. That's one thing. It's something else completely for a large, essentially public health body to come out and say it's unacceptable to be above a certain weight. And as soon as you've got those loud voices and that sort of credibility message coming through, that's when things started to take a turn. So it wasn't just that you had a higher risk of different whatevers at a higher weight. It then became, oh, well, you need to avoid being that weight at
Mm-hmm.
all costs. And you need, if you are already larger, you need to do everything in your, everything possible to no longer be in that larger body. Because a more pragmatic approach would be, okay, that's a higher risk. So we need to actually make sure that we are screening that high risk population properly, and that we've got effective treatments to help that high risk population.
Right.
But that's not what happens. Perception that BMI is something that's manipulatable easily, feasibly, has sent us down the garden path.
Oh, so true. And I think when I look at this globally, and obviously I don't have the level of detail in mind that you do because you've just been pouring yourself over this research and this is your life. But the way I conceptualize it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is just, this became part of our culture. This became part of kind of how we saw the world, how we parented our children, how
Yeah,
doctors talked to their patients, how friends talked with each other, what we saw on TV, what we saw,
yeah,
um, you know, in the
yeah.
media.
It's
And I think,
completely. It's created a completely consistent message that advertising was already quite weight centric all the way through. From 1900 or so, there was, people were concerned around weight from an aesthetic perspective. And then we've got the jumping in of the medical perspective as well.
yeah, and
And
then
everything's
it's
consistent.
when you're steeped in that systemically, kind of when you're steeped in that as a child, and then you grow up and you become someone who studies this or researches this, you don't even necessarily question the basic premise of, like,
No,
is
right.
this true? It's like, okay,
Exactly.
that's true, and I'm going to study why that's true, right? Which
Right.
isn't necessarily great science, but I think it's something for the listeners to understand is we act as if science is completely unbiased, and we're all
Yeah.
checking that all the time, and I think obviously that's the goal, but that's not always the reality, and we
No.
all come to our work, our research, our nutrition therapy, or whatever we're doing for our jobs, like we're coming to it with these biases, and it's
Yeah.
important to look at that.
A part of the problem, or part of the reason we got here, in my observation, is we've got health professionals and researchers of particular disciplines. And the trouble with those assumptions is that, so let's take an exercise scientist, for example. They've got all of their skills in exercise science, but they quite frequently want to do research around weight and weight loss. And so they make all these assumptions about what people should be eating and about energy balance and about feasibility and all that sort of stuff. All of that is predicated on their unseen weight biases. And it's the same for medical professionals who then go on to research as well. I see this big unnoticed knowledge gap about eating behavior that dietitians have and some psychologists have, but because all of our base training is siloed in our particular discipline. And so, you know, dietitians may make assumptions about eating behavior that aren't exactly true, but they don't know that they're true. They absolutely have no idea. And then psychologists make assumptions about metabolic processes. They don't have the skills. They don't have that base training around metabolism, chemistry, you know, all of the actual nuts and bolts of what happens once food goes into the body. They make those assumptions around what happens. And a lot of the time they're weight centric. And so that's why we've got this big piling on of psychologists at the moment trying to be weight loss consultants.
This is such a fascinating thing. And I've thought about this so much, where I see a gap in my experiences of what I sit with my clients and talk to them about and hear their stories and really learn about what different people from all different walks of life, like what their eating looks like and what their lifestyles look like and what their thinking looks like. And I've learned every single thing I thought I knew has been, you know, thrown out the window. It's like I mean, you just learn so much sitting with people and having those conversations day in, day out. But then if
we can learn from our patients.
Yeah,
we need to actively learn from our patients and not assume that we know more than they do about their own eating. I mean,
absolutely.
Far out.
But there's such a gap between, I mean, the people doing research about this don't necessarily have the practical real life experience of sitting down and talking to lots of people about what they eat, you know? And so I think you're right. They come to this with this assumption of like, we're going to just assume that this thing that I've been taught about weight or about bodies or about nutrition is true, because maybe they don't have that practical element that I feel really privileged to have. I mean, I know a lot of doctors don't even have that privilege of really listening.
Yes. Well, I mean, a lot of the time they don't have the time to either. So they have to, by definition, work on all of these, you know, on all these assumptions to just get through their day with so many different competing interests. But, you know, I'm really lucky. My PhD is cross-disciplinary. So I'm a dietitian by training, and I have 2 dietitians as my PhD supervisors. But my primary supervisor and the school that I'm doing the PhD through is School of Psychology and Counselling. So it's cross-disciplinary.
Oh, that's so amazing. What a perfect program.
Incredible. Yeah, to have a psychologist as my primary supervisor has been magic. I've learned so much. And you know, it's really highlighted where the gaps in our training is. And I mean, I think most Hays dietitians are, you know, would also make very good psychologists and counsellors if they had chosen that discipline as their primary discipline as well. You know, it really lends itself to that type of practice.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, what a great program you're in. So you have a podcast, and remind me what it's called.
Okay, so my podcast is called Unpacking Weight Science.
Okay.
And it basically, my perspective is weight neutral. So I champion weight neutral research and also unpick and unpack these assumptions that we sort of blithely, you know, rolling around every day using and not realizing that it's an assumption. It's not based on proper, you know, truth. And also unpacking the nuts and bolts of scientific process. So looking at research design, looking at the anatomy of a research paper, looking at how to read these things and see, as I said before, the devil in the details. So what does a between group versus a within group analysis actually do? Because that makes a great difference in terms of their conclusions. All of that's what the podcast is about.
Oh,
It
you are
is just
so
me.
needed.
It is just me talking. I don't have any interviews on there, but the podcasts, each one is 20 minutes because I figure, well, I mean, if you're lucky, that's your commute in the morning, right? And it comes with further reading materials and a self-test quiz and supporting materials, including diagrams and all the rest of it.
How very academic of you.
I know, right? I'm so sad. So sad if I'm not lecturing, I'm sort of accidentally lecturing. I've found a way to continue to do that. I do come from a long line of teachers, so I always blame my genetics when it comes to that.
Yes. So I want to talk about a few specific studies, if you're okay with that. So one recent one that just came out that I think is maybe on people's minds is they were looking at I'm not going to remember the name, but you probably do, the low fat versus low carb, which is like the age old question. I can't believe we're still even doing that, but you made a fascinating point about the conclusions and about some of the fine print that obviously isn't going to be highlighted in their conclusions or even in the media coverage or headlines. So kind of break that down. And while you're at it, I would love to give little practical tips for the layperson when they're looking at a study or when they're hearing a headline. How can they be critical consumers of those things?
Right. So this low fat versus low carb head-to-head randomized trial basically did not give us anything new about the success rate of weight loss. They still showed the same pattern that everyone does, and that's short-term weight loss in the first 6 to 12 months, followed by weight regain after that. I've heard it described as a Nike tick, and that's not actually a bad way to describe the shape of that curve. Within 2 to 5 years, the weight is back for the vast majority of people. So in this study, they were making a big song and dance about it being a ad libitum eating study. So that just means people were not told exactly what to eat, right? So they didn't give them a meal plan, but they did give them they obviously had to eat low carb or low fat in terms of macronutrient breakdown, because that was the point of the study. But they let the people organise that themselves. The participants organise that themselves. But what that meant in real life is that they are using an app for that. They're charting what they ate and they're watching their macros. And part of that process includes watching calories. So the fact that they've said that it's ad libitum is actually, okay, fine. They didn't give them a meal plan, but this is hardly eat to appetite what you feel like at the time. That's got a wide variety. There is still a lot of directional stuff given about what they were going to eat. And all of those apps come with the calories. So the fact that they said that, these people weren't counting calories and they still lost weight, that completely ignores the fact that they literally would have seen how many calories they were eating every single day, every time they logged those foods that they ate,
right? You can't really track macronutrient without
right.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
And so no, it wasn't ad libitum, thank you very much, but thanks for trying. And then the other thing was in the other really great thing about that study was in the supplementary materials, because of course the point that they were trying to make was, look, neither diet is superior, so stop with the diet battles, right? That was their sort of reason for running the trial.
Which, what, I can kind of appreciate that a little bit.
I get it.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But what's really interesting for us as weight neutral interested people is that they depicted their findings. So this is in the supplementary material. Buried in there are a couple of waterfall plots, and they are my favourite. I love these charts. I just totally geeked out then. But anyway,
you geek out as much as you want.
So on a waterfall plot, you've got every single participant gets its own line, right? And so you can actually see what the journey, for want of a better word, of every single participant in the study was. And they line them up from the people who lost the most weight through to the people who gained weight. So in ascending order of
Okay.
magnitude of weight change. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Totally.
So in there, you can see that there about a third of them did lose like 10 or more kilos over that trial. I can't even remember how long the trial was, but over that time, which would have been significant for those individuals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that they were the ones who were paying most attention to the calories and to the nuts and bolts of following the instructions in the study. They were eating least ad libitum style. And then you can see that actually most people were lost between sort of 2 and 4 kilos over the follow-up, over the period.
Okay.
And then you've got a bunch of people who put on weight. And then you've also got, not depicted, but still, you know, should be remembered, is the people who dropped out of the study. So there's a bunch of people who didn't finish, where we don't know whether they gained. Yeah.
Which is always a part of this. And something to think about in any of these studies is people are going to drop out. And what does that mean? Not necessarily, you know, one thing or another. It's just an important piece of information to have too.
That's it. So some could have fallen pregnant and dropped out of the study. That is fine. But others may well have gained a heap of weight and could not face the researchers again.
Right.
So
you're more likely to come back to the researchers when you're like, look at me, I'm your A+ student, don't you think?
Yeah, it's a big deal to be in a research study. You feel, you know, that anyone who's in a research study like this, where you have committed to making these big-ish lifestyle changes, is what is called a motivated volunteer. So they're actually instantly not like the general population. We're talking about, it's sort of like these are already the cream of the crop of the people. If the thing is real, if the phenomenon that they're investigating is real in terms of dietary change, they're the people who are most likely to actually succeed in doing the thing that the research team is asking you.
That is so interesting and something I haven't thought about, but such an important part of being critical or critically consuming this stuff, you know?
Yeah. This is not like regular human with a busy life. These are people who've got enough time and the sort of like, you know, selfless inclination to be part of a research study instead of just do a thing on your own time, you know?
Yes. Okay.
So the waterfall plots were identical for the low carb arm and the low, what was the other one? Low fat arm. So you can see the pattern was the same. And so that to me says, look, this is diet. You get these people who lose a fair bit and they are dragging the average down. So I think they reported that the weight loss in both groups was something like 5 or 6 kilos, right? But actually that describes very few people in the study. Some lost heaps, some gained. But all of the results, because the average was about 5 kilos, you've got people potentially moving more and all the rest of it. Perhaps they were eating more veggies than they were before the trial. You know, so there's some potentially actual material differences between the lifestyles pre and post the intervention that have got nothing to do with weight change and everything to do with those lifestyle behaviours that, you know, in HAES we try to encourage because they are independently good for you. All of that, like they use the whole group, the whole sort of low fat groups. Average ends up being low because you've got these few people who are super weight losers. And then you've got all of the biochemical results and all the rest of it also reported for the whole group, but there's going to be massive variation in those as well.
How long was this? I mean, you don't know exactly how long it was. You don't remember, I think you mentioned, but when we look at any of these studies, they're usually nothing past 2-year follow-up.
Oh, no, it's certainly less than 2 years. I think it might be 12 months follow-up.
Which doesn't really tell us anything because there's no doubt that, you know, people can not no doubt, but there's a lot of studies that can produce weight loss in the short term, right? And then we see in the long term.
It's a party trick. Anyone can do it, just about. Any old researcher who's got any crackpot idea that ends up with people eating less and maybe moving a bit more, changing their lifestyle, if they analyse a control group who's doing nothing differently to their intervention group who's doing, you know, like jumping up and down on a leg 3 times, 50 times a day or whatever, some way to elicit a calorie decrease, they will get a change. They'll get something they can get some stats out
And
of.
not in every person, but on average, right?
Yeah,
So, and
right.
that's
So
an
when you
important
compare
thing to
group
say.
to group, that's the thing. When you compare group to group, you miss that the real picture of what's going on with those participants in the group,
Yes.
because you're just comparing group averages. It's not really it's not a fair way to do this analysis.
And the thing is, when an individual is looking at what do I want to do to lose weight, let's just say, that's not always you can't always translate something you're seeing in a short term. Obviously, that's problematic, but in an average of a group, because like you mentioned, there are some people who
Yeah,
lost, far more weight than the average. There's some people who gained
yeah,
weight. And so that's, I mean, on an individual basis, their experience was
right.
very different.
Yeah, so and that's another point that I always try to uh, help people understand is that, okay, so we've got these group stats. What that actually means is that we can only predict stuff in groups. We have no predictive power in an individual as to be able to predict what's going to happen with that particular person. When we've got 100 people, we can predict that there'll be an average of whatever lost, blah, blah, blah. But at an individual level, okay, you have to look at the ranges, the standard deviations of the reported differences to get an idea about just what the likely, the potential outcome of them doing that. So, okay, so if you are like the people who were originally in the study, if you're already like them, then if there were 100 of you, the average
Yeah.
weight loss or whatever outcome would be this. But we know that individuals in there had experiences that ranged from losing 11 kilos to gaining 11 kilos. And so for you particularly, I can't predict with any accuracy what's going to happen if you follow this eating plan, except to say that the overwhelming likelihood is that you may lose a bit of weight initially, but you will see it again by 2 to 5 years.
So that is the crux of why we practice the way we do, right? It's
Yeah,
because it
it's
doesn't feel
dishonest.
ethical to promise
Yeah.
something that you can't promise.
Yeah, right. And if we have given people full informed consent, and so that
That's
means if someone
huge.
comes in with weight concern, that you say, right, we these days have actually got a ton of options. One option is to do nothing differently, just keep doing what you're doing. And that is a legitimate choice because people's lives are hard. Another option is to go down any of the weight loss um, routes. And that, here are the long term and short term likely outcomes. Here is a realistic expectation of what that life is going to be like. You can choose that. And that includes sort of surgery, includes all the things,
Right.
all the options really they have in terms of wanting to lose weight. Or there's this third option now, which is doing health promoting things and listening to yourself and self-acceptance work and self-compassion competence building work, which has got these short and long-term likely outcomes. And here are the benefits and risks associated with that. And now it's up to you to choose. I'm not going to break your personal autonomy because of my particular personal preference for a particular type of practice. You get to choose. And the thing is that if you're a HAES dietitian, like I personally could not put anyone on a weight loss diet now, knowing what I know. I would feel that I was not practicing within my ethical standards to do that. But I recognize that that is not the way that many other people feel. And so it's my, again, ethical duty to refer that person to a weight loss service if that is what they desperately want right now. And in the future, they may come back to weight neutral practice. But you can't force people into it.
No, you
Just
can't.
like, it's just as ethically reprehensible for a HAES dietitian to force someone into HAES if they don't want it, as it is for a weight loss dietitian to force somebody into weight loss if that person would otherwise have chosen a different method or a different approach.
Oh, that's
And we
such a
have to
good point.
really keep our um, ethical practice hat on here and be able to untangle what our personal preferences and biases are from supporting patient autonomy at all turns.
Oh, that is huge. And I think that helps our patients and clients feel safe too, right?
Yeah,
To
it's a
know
specialty.
it,
Hayes practice is a specialty.
yes.
We should be treating it the same way as we treat our, clients who come to a generalist dietitian and who have kidney failure. If I haven't done hospital work in a renal ward for 10 years,
Right.
it's unsafe for me to give that person, like, I would not be able to give them evidence based advice at that
Right.
time. So I'd have
Right.
to refer to a colleague to do that. And so I hope that weight loss dietitians start to think about Hayes practice in that way. They should be recognizing that they don't have the skills and that their client may, in fact, want that, and to refer on and recognize that, that's that.
That is a really, really good point. So you've just had your head in the research for your podcast, for your PhD, for the
Yeah,
work
yeah,
that you
yeah.
do. What things kind of stand out, maybe at like a high level, take home messages that you wish people knew about weight science and research around these issues? What are some things that you think people get just wrong with
Yeah.
with
So
that?
one big thing that regular humans misunderstand, scientists misunderstand it as well, but it's most toxic in regular humans, is this idea that the weight loss is doing the work while you're losing weight. So the actual change in the scale numbers is getting the credit for all of that behavior change that is going on to elicit that number change. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So while they're thinking it is that change on the scales that is leading to the better health outcome, it's actually that they're moving more, because that will independently reduce your cholesterol levels on average in a group of people. You can do that, make people more active, and their biochem will improve objectively. I mean, that is what the Hayes outcomes find anyway. So there's also things that are working independently in the background, and then weight loss scoots in and takes the credit for it.
Oh, that is so true.
So
Decoupling weight
that's a big
loss
thing.
from health outcomes and
Yeah.
how you can see that, yeah, that doesn't deserve all the credit. It's
No.
it's you got to look at these other factors.
And so the question that they need to ask themselves, and so do doctors, if there's any doctors listening, please, what do you do with someone is living in a body that is classed in the sort of normal BMI range? What do you do with them right now? That is literally what a human body will do, regardless of its weight. So somebody in the normal weight range with high cholesterol, you go, right, let's have a look at your diet. Let's see if there's any dietary factors that are influencing your cholesterol levels now to try to help you perhaps reduce your risk of having some sort of cardiovascular event in the future. Not weight focused at all, right? So you would do that with somebody in a larger body, because that we know that has an independent effect. People, as soon as they pass the BMI categorization, does not mean that all of that foundational science goes out the window. Still human beings.
So let me just summarize. So you're saying if a doctor or anyone who's providing advice about labs or advice about dietary
Yeah,
changes, ask yourself, how would I talk to this
yeah,
person? What would I advise them to do, or what would we talk through together if this person's BMI was within the quote
yeah.
normal range,
So the
and
little
provide that same
catchphrase,
advice to everybody,
yeah, what would I do with a BMI of 22?
right?
What would I do with a BMI of 22? And then that cuts through all of the weight bias, right? Because somebody with a BMI of 22 at the moment is in that most privileged weight group that isn't hassled.
Right.
They're not assumed to be like on their way up and, impending doom if they're gaining
Right.
weight. And they're not considered to be too thin.
Right.
They are sitting right in the middle of the, like, we don't worry about you in terms of your weight space.
Right.
And so the advice that we would give somebody with a BMI of 22 in a weight-centric paradigm is literally the advice that should be the first port of call in terms of lifestyle advice for somebody with any size of BMI.
Well, and I think another really important point is you would ask questions, right? You'd say, "Okay, so tell me about your
Oh yeah,
eating. Tell me about your
yeah,
exercise." Whereas someone with a higher BMI, you oftentimes, especially the way maybe we're trained in this really weight-centric paradigm, is to just assume you already know that, and that's not always at all
no.
true. It's not
That's it.
always
At an
true.
individual level, there's no way we can predict how somebody lives from looking at them. We have to ask them. There is no alternative.
Questions are key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't make assumptions.
It's such a cliche, but such an important kind of thing to have in your mind,
Yeah.
um, especially when you're
And it
trying to
really,
help
I mean, it
people.
totally aggravates people to be, when health providers assume all of these things about their lifestyle, it's, unfairly negatively assess their lifestyle behaviors without ever investigating what their
Okay, and
lifestyle is
so
like. Gaslighting.
this affects people in ways that maybe we don't always think about, and let's highlight it. So when someone knows that you're assuming that about them, and let's just say it happens to not be true at all, this person is engaged in their
Yeah.
movement and in
Yeah.
their nutrition and in their health, and that's important to them. That's
So they're
something they
literally
value.
doing what the doctor has told them to do. They're literally
Right.
performing all of those things
It makes
that the
them not
doctor
want to
has
go
told
back.
them to do. Oh no, of course.
You
Why
say,
would
well,
you?
then I'm not going
That
to subject myself to that, and
yeah,
that can negatively affect your health. Then you don't catch, some health condition early.
yeah,
You wait till it gets really chronic because you're really have this phobia of going and seeing the
yeah.
doctor.
And you end up doctor shopping out of
Yeah,
desperation. And so nobody's got your sort of longitudinal health record. So that again is another risk, to put all
absolutely.
of your eggs in the basket of one 5-minute consultation when it comes to serious,
Yeah.
serious, life limiting, potentially the sort of diagnosis that might be made. It's a massive risk. So people want to feel understood. They deserve to feel heard and understood by their health provider. And so making these assumptions just puts that wall up.
You're so right. This is such an important conversation, and I'm really hoping this is helpful for people listening. So that stands out to you as something that we all could do better, is to really assess how would we talk to someone about this cholesterol number we're seeing if this person had a BMI of 22, and
Yeah.
really just looking at that and consistently assessing that in ourselves. What else has jumped out at you in the research, that you wish people knew?
I wish people knew that this idea that if you eat right, that your body will naturally go to like naturally chart down the BMI scale into the healthy weight range. There's this assumption that just finding that right way to eat and my body will then work normally. My big message is your body works normally now. Weight is not an indicator of how well your body is using the types of foods that you put into it.
That is such a
This
hard one, don't you
It
think?
is really hard because we're sold that idea, and even our national health, like the food selection guidelines, the plate, and
Right.
we have a pie chart in Australia, similar sort of thing. Um, Says, eat this way, maintain a healthy weight, as if eating that way will help you maintain a healthy weight. But we know that people who eat that way, there's the same proportion in each of the BMI categories of people who do eat to the plate. And if eating to the plate actually resulted in body weight reduction in the long term, A, we would already know that through experimental studies, but B, people will be overrepresented. So those who do eat to the guidelines would be massively overrepresented in the normal weight range category, but they're not. It's like normal weight range is about 9% of people eat to the guideline specifications, and even in the like the obese range, it's 11%.
Okay, that's
Actually,
really
swap that.
fascinating.
Sorry, it's 11% in the normal and 9% in the obese range and 10% in the overweight range.
So you're
That
saying,
difference does not explain the weight difference.
right, you're saying, and I think you've actually posted a visual of this, and I
I
just
have,
have it
yeah.
in my
There's
mind.
out there, yeah,
Right? Like just a bunch of different people, bunch of different body types, and like you have little arrows like this person binges and this person binges and this person eats lots of veggies and this person eats lots of veggies and just
yeah.
like we
You
cannot
cannot tell.
tell. And I think it's hard for the average person to really trust that. I think it's easier for
Yeah.
me. I feel like I have this privilege because I talk to people all day about this stuff, and I know I can think of 10 examples of people that I work with who would probably blow a lot of people's minds with the way they appear and the way that they care for themselves. Just
Yeah.
because it's just anyway. I have that privilege because that's what I do for work,
That's it.
but not
You're
everybody
practiced at
does.
listening to people and not making assumptions. So that's the thing. We have to use that. We have to practice that skill because in our clinical judgment, the way that we develop clinical judgment through our training as health professionals, we are trained to be doing like meta thinking whilst listening to the client. We're not trained to just sit and listen and then judge. We're trained to do it all in the same, so if someone can be telling us all this stuff, but we're like already deciding that they're a non-compliant
Right,
client, right?
right. That is so true.
Already deciding that we're going to put them on a weight loss diet based on their BMI rather than actually listening first to their 30-year history of weight cycling.
Oh,
So we
that's
have
such
to
a good point.
unpack that skill set, like uncouple our clinical judgment until we've finished listening and start to negotiate with the client around what they want and what their options are.
I love
This
that.
open-mindedness.
So, Fiona, I'm always sensitive to, people just getting on iTunes and typing in the word nutrition and then finding my podcast. And sometimes I'm like, okay, I feel like in every episode, I just try to think, what if this is a person's very first time listening to this? What can we do to help them feel welcome here and to help them make sure that we're not I never want to alienate someone and make them
Mm.
think, oh, these wacko dietitians are talking about crazy stuff. I don't even get where they're coming from. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the basics. Like,
Okay.
are you anti weight loss?
I'm anti-pursuit of weight loss because of the harm that can cause that I've seen with my own eyes, that I have experienced in my own life, and that I see in the research constantly. So
And
I'm
there's a
not,
big
weight
difference, right?
changes
There's a
over the life.
distinction.
Yeah, over the lifespan, people's weight is meant to change. Now, a population across time, weight changes. That's a normal part of life. And as soon as we start pathologizing just that normal weight change, not weight change associated with like illness, we want to pick that up. We are interested in that.
Right.
But in terms of the way that a body is throughout its lifespan and being as strong and as well, weight is pretty irrelevant.
I love it. So I just think that sometimes when people hear me talking about like this idea of weight neutral practices and why we do this, I get feedback like, where is this coming from? Why are you anti weight loss? And I think that there is this distinction between we're not saying if you happen to lose weight based on making
Yeah, if you
changes, that's
right,
not,
we're not going to boot you out of the movement for that. That does happen.
yeah,
But the point is, if we look at groups of people who make weight neutral changes, and the weight neutral part is only in its intention, it's not in its outcome.
absolutely, that's huge. Yes.
Yeah. So we know that within that group, particularly if people have got complicated histories around eating and around dieting, that some will gain, some will lose weight, and some will stay about the same. So it is unethical of us to make any sort of prediction as to what will happen in that particular person. I'm not anti-weight change that happens. If it does happen and it happens really easily, my flag goes up and I think, oh, are they concurrently have they got some sort of grumbling cancer in there that we don't know about? What else might be going on that explains the rapid weight loss? Because that's a death knell for a human being, is unintentional rapid weight loss. So that would be the flag that comes up, but we're certainly not anti-weight change. It's just the pursuit of it that's toxic as anything.
And I think we're also the other key is, as people who are communicating these messages to lots and lots of people, we're also trying to kind of demoralize the idea of weight loss always being good and weight gain always being bad, because there are people who it is very much a result of making some healthy changes to their eating and to their lifestyle. They gain weight because that's what their body needed to do for whatever reason, right? So it's just, the idea is just to demoralize food, which also helps to demoralize some of this stuff about what our bodies do with it.
Yeah. Our value is nourishment, and that can come at a variety of different weights and changes to weight as well. So we could put nourishment right there in the front of our value minds. That is where it's at. Weight change can be an indication of change of nutrition status, and that includes weight gain. And that's a good thing for that person if they were malnourished to start with.
Absolutely. So one other thing that I think maybe we need to talk about, just to do our due diligence with this topic of kind of trying to unpack some of the weight science, is the National Weight Control Registry.
Yes.
That's something that's often cited as, okay, well, the people who are successful with weight loss are the people who always eat breakfast. That's like the famous, the famous thing people take from that. I feel people talk about that all the time. So I think I was just at a conference where Reagan Chastain broke this down, and she did such a fabulous job.
Great.
So
yes, I love her. Yeah. I consider the National Weight Control Registry to be, and I've called it this before on the public record, to be the unicorn stable. So there are these statistical unicorns, those who do lose weight and keep it off. And by definition, they're outliers. And so they're not, the findings and the lifestyles that they lead are not generalizable to the general population. Again, it's the same kind of difference between those motivated volunteers who put their hand up to do relatively long research studies where every day they have to do something different from prior to the study,
Yeah.
Plus, so it was like, okay, so it's interesting. I don't think it's useless to have the National Weight Control Registry. I actually think that, okay, that can guide some of our expectation conversations. If you do want to lose weight and keep it off, these are the characteristics that the people who have said that they're doing that have. And this is everyday low-fat, calorie-restricted diet, no exceptions, including no exceptions for Thanksgiving and Christmas and other holiday days. 60 to 90 minutes of exercise every single day. And if those two things happened in a person in a smaller bodied, like relatively weight stable person, we would not see that as normal, flexible eating.
Yeah, I would be like, okay, let's try to add in some flexibility and some relaxation and leisure and
yeah, exactly. And so it's not that like you've gone on the diet and you've lost the weight and living a healthy, flexible lifestyle is going to maintain it. And we know that is not going to happen. You're most likely going to need to white knuckle it for the rest of your life. And even those who continue to white knuckle it, there's a lot of movement in and out of that registry. You've got relatively few people who've been in it for a long, 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 long time, because you only have to have lost 30 pounds for a year, I think it is. When you regain the weight, you're out. You're bumped off the list if you're honest about having regained the weight, because it's all self-report. So, unless somebody's saying, okay, yes, I can help you lose weight, but the likely if you're going to have any chance to maintain those weight losses, this is what your life's going to look like forever.
What's jumping out to me is that famous Deb Brigard quote where she says, what we prescribe to fat people is what we diagnose
Yeah.
in thin people, right? And
Right.
so it's like, sure,
Exactly.
yeah, you can do this, and but you're going to have to develop an eating disorder, which is
Yeah.
so problematic on the ethical level for
Yeah.
clinicians, right?
Right. Exactly. And I see it as another it's another example of where mainstream health practice others people in larger bodies. So people in larger bodies tend to be infantized. They tend to be spoken down to, not listened to, asked to do things that would be deemed unethical in a smaller weight person. It's this discriminatory attitude and discriminatory practices against people in larger bodies. It's unacceptable.
So Reagan Chastain in her presentation that I was just at, I'm going to give her all this credit, but I just really wanted to outline what she talked about. She said that in the National Weight Control Registry, success was considered 30 pounds loss, 30 pounds of weight loss for 1 year, and there were 10,000 successes since 1994. Which, on the surface, she's like, "Yay, good! Like, doesn't that sound like such a great number?" But then when you look at
It's a
how
lot of
many,
people in America.
yeah, like if you look at how many diets since 1994, and you do the math, it's over a billion since 1994.
Yeah,
So you do the math and it's
yeah,
like 0.0009% of people are quote successful.
yeah,
And it's some this math, it's mind-boggling. And
yeah.
so
And
when
again,
yeah, go ahead.
it's already in every weight loss intervention paper that's followed for up to 2 to 5 years. If there were enough people who were losing weight and keeping it off, we would be able to get those participants from those studies. That is proof in itself about how rare these unicorns are.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, they are the rare unicorns. I love that.
They're the rare ones that end up with book deals and on Dr. Oz and Oprah. They're the ones that end up being obnoxious on social media because they feel like if they can do it, anyone can. But actually, they are special, but not in the way that they think.
Right. Right.
Mm.
Okay. So, do you want to just take a quick minute to talk about what the research says about um, fitness as an indicator of health, regardless of weight?
Yeah, sure. Um,
Sorry, I kind of threw
well,
that one out at you.
I know. So no, well, it's good. It apart from stopping smoking, if you smoke, is the next most influential effector of all-cause mortality. So, I
Yes.
mean, no, it's quite interesting for a dietitian to accept that, but I accept that it's much more effective than dietary changes are, to the magnitude of about 3 times or more
Okay, so this is
effective.
going to bother people who hear on social media that eating is 80% and exercise is 20. I mean, people love to say
Yeah.
that.
Oh, of weight
It's,
loss, right? If you
yeah,
want to lose weight, you do need to, like it makes more of a difference that because it's easier to get a calorie deficit if you fiddle
sure,
with food than it
sure.
is if you fiddle with the exercise. But in terms of like actual health outcomes, exercise is excellent. And part of that is because it's a more succinct intervention. If the
Right.
food stuff there's so many
So
different
many
ways
variables.
to look at that eating behavior, so many different ways that because of the nature of that, it's difficult to pin down what's doing the work. I mean, probably fruit and veggies in there is, of all the foods that we eat, but exercise just is hugely much more effective in a group of people in a like life cohort at reducing mortality risk.
So, and yeah, I think that that's a really important thing to work on. And I think one of the things I encourage people to think about in terms of exercise and movement is to really try their very best to kind of decouple that from weight loss, because for so
Yeah,
many chronic dieters, weight or exercise is this almost synonymous with weight loss, and you only do it when you're
yeah,
dieting. And I
that's it. You've got
think,
to disconnect it.
right, right.
Yeah,
Just
and the
look
way
at
that
it
you
as
can
this
tell if you've
valuable
done it,
thing on its own. So go ahead.
yeah, the way that you can tell if you have been successful at uncoupling the body movement from any weight dreams,
Uh-huh.
is the feeling that you get if you don't do exercise as you'd planned. So say you sort of wanted to go for a walk. If you didn't end up getting to go for the walk and you feel guilty for that, then you're still in a diet mentality. If you feel disappointed, you're in a non-diet mentality place. So just having a think about the way that you feel if you miss exercise or miss your physical activity or joyful movement session, that will give you a clue as to where you are in terms of your transition across paradigms.
Love it. And to be very compassionate with yourself in the process, because it's really,
Oh yeah.
this is potentially decades and decades of undoing
Yes.
we're trying
Yeah,
to
yeah.
work on.
And those thoughts will come back, because they're really conditioned, as you said. Those thoughts, if you try to unpack it, you can promote that thought to pop into your head. But just being really gentle with observing your emotional landscape around missing an exercise session can help to give you some clues. But yeah, I mean, it's totally understandable that those thoughts may be there. But when when you get to that disappointment feeling being predominant, then you know that you've done a lot of work to get there. It should be commended.
Yes, love that. That's really, really, really awesome. So let's just do a quick kind of high level summary of kind of what you wish people knew, and also I think we really want people to listen to your podcast because you're going to take people deeper into the actual studies, give them tips to kind of
Yeah,
work through that and navigate this really tricky world of science and research around this stuff.
that's it. If they want to learn everything, not everything, but if they want to, there is an online course as well that they can do now and work through the modules
Perfect.
rather than waiting for each podcast to come out. Because it's only a 20-minute podcast. I get really frustrated that I can't just mind dump into every podcast.
Yeah.
I just transfer what I know to all the listeners. It takes time. And of course, it takes time to peel away that onion of assumptions as well. But there is an online course people can do now that's ready that they can work through in their own time if they want to be moving through things faster than waiting for each fortnightly
How do they
podcast to
find
come
that,
out.
Fiona?
So they can look on unpackingweightscience.com. That's my sort of the project website, and that combines the online course, which is ready now, the podcast, which started early March. I've got them all planned out for the next 2 years, but of course it takes
Wow.
time to dribble those out, right?
That's awesome.
And then there will be a book when I finish writing it. So the
Oh,
book's not out
that's
yet.
so great.
But so that people can actually reference, this is this type of study. Let me see. What am I meant to be looking out for here? That's the book, but you can't get it yet. But right now, the course is where if you want to consume this stuff swiftly, do the course. And if you're happy to have it drip fed to you and listen to some different perspectives and have a bit more time taken around the issues, then the podcast is the one.
That's great. So
Yeah.
unpacking weight science, and then your other website is healthnotdiets.com, right?
Yeah. So my day job is not only the unpacking weight science, but I train dietitians to paradigm shift, essentially. So dietitians, I train with Fiona Sutherland, who's another dietitian down here in Oz. We go around Australia and give 1 and 2 day workshops for dietitians. And then I do the same for psychologists, counsellors, doctors, other allied health professionals with Louise Adams, who's clinical psychologist. So
Well, maybe
those
that's why
workshops.
Australia is so with it, because you guys are doing all that great work.
Yeah, Fee Sutherland and I worked out that we have done now more than 10% of the entire dietetic workforce in Australia.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
incredible.
and it's not, so that's members who are people who are members of our professional association.
Uh-huh.
But in terms of penetration into those who are working in areas where weight is pertinent, because the whole number is made up of all, everyone, dietitians working in ICU,
Right.
in renal, like all the other areas that don't necessarily have a practice where they would be recommending weight loss to people regularly. Right. So we've got actually much more penetration than 10% through in the dietetic cohort who does come into contact with people with weight concern who want to do something about it with the dietitian. So yeah, I'm really proud of the amount that we've trained, and I'm really pleased with the amount of interest that we continue to have every year when we go back to these cities to give the workshops again and do the advanced extension stuff. It's great.
That's amazing. And it's so needed. And I think that, what you said earlier, I wanted to comment on it, but it's coming back to me now, is this thing that you mentioned about the study you did where you were assessing dietitians' views of weight inclusive practices, and how you realized that those who didn't agree to it or didn't like it, or I don't remember the words you used, but it was more of a misunderstanding.
Yes.
That is what I think we're working with. I think that's why we need to communicate this message in ways that people can hear us, because it's not usually a disagreement in philosophy. It's usually just I'm not doing a good job of explaining what this is and what this isn't.
That's it. So it's not that we are completely different creatures. We still share the values of nourishment, of client-centered care, of all of, we're still caring human beings, and we're trying to do our best. Those who were still quite weight-centric tended to have a higher level of confidence that any weight that people lost would be kept off at 5 years. And so they simply didn't know or didn't accept that that dietitians are just as hopeless as everyone else at eliciting lasting weight loss. It's a hard pill to swallow. But so there was that sort of maybe denial or just ignorance of those stats, and coupled with assumptions around being incorrect about assumptions about HAES practice, that it's not no rules, that's the other sort of perception, that it's not nothing. They didn't realize that it is actually, it's got its whole, theoretical framework, its underlying, the underlying motivational theories that explain why it works the way it works. All of that it's all there. It's all done. But if you don't know anything about it, you assume that it's not as big as it is.
Right. And I wish we had time to dive into that, because I'm sure people are like, I want to go there.
Another time.
We should do it. This has been so lovely. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing all of this. This was so great.
You're welcome. Everyone needs to know this stuff. Happy to talk forever about it.
Well, you did a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.